The earth never lies, but Plot 47B wouldn't stay put. I'm Marcus, and I've been groundskeeper at Willowbrook Cemetery for 23 years. In that time, I've seen soil shift from frost, graves settle from poor drainage, and headstones tilt from root growth. Natural processes, all of them. What I witnessed at Plot 47B wasn't natural. The burial had been routine. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, age 78, passed peacefully in her sleep. The service was small, just her nephew and a handful of neighbors. Standard mahogany casket, nothing fancy. We lowered her into the ground on a Tuesday morning in October, when the maples were just starting to turn. I filled the grave myself, using the backhoe for the heavy work, and hand finishing the top 2 feet like always. Packed it down solid, laid the sod, watered it in. By Thursday, the plot looked perfect. Friday morning, I noticed the settling. Not unusual, graves often sink a few inches as the soil compresses around the casket. I added a wheelbarrow of dirt, leveled it off, and thought nothing more of it. But Monday brought the same problem. The earth had sunk again, this time nearly 6 inches. I filled it a second time, pressing the dirt down with the back of my shovel. By Wednesday, Plot 47B had sunk again. This time, the depression was deep enough that I could see the casket's corner through the disturbed soil. I'd never seen settling this severe, not in over 2 decades. Something was wrong with the ground underneath, maybe a natural cavity or old septic line. I'd have to dig it up and investigate. That afternoon, I brought the backhoe over and carefully removed the loose topsoil. What I found made my stomach clench. The casket's polished mahogany lid was slightly ajar, not enough to see inside, but enough to let in air and moisture. The brass hinges gleamed in the afternoon sun, and I could see that the seal around the edge had been broken from within. I shut off the backhoe and climbed down into the grave. The casket's locking mechanism was still engaged, the exterior latches secure. But somehow, the lid had been pushed up from inside with enough force to break the gasket seal. I ran my fingers along the gap, feeling cool air drift up from the casket's interior. My hands shook as I lifted my radio to call the office. This required the coroner, the family, maybe even the police. But as I stood there in that 6-foot hole, staring at the impossible gap in Mrs. Hartwell's casket, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A soft scratching sound was coming from inside the casket. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Then silence. Then again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I scrambled out of that grave faster than a man my age should be able to move. From ground level, I could still hear it, that patient, persistent scratching coming from 6 feet down. I called Dr. Morrison, the coroner, and within an hour, he arrived with his assistant and the proper equipment to open the casket safely. What we found inside was Mrs. Hartwell, exactly as she'd been buried. Her hands were folded peacefully across her chest, her face serene. The white silk lining of the casket was unmarked, showing no signs of disturbance. But the underside of the lid bore deep scratches in the wood, dozens of them, gouged so deeply that curls of mahogany lay scattered across Mrs. Hartwell's folded hands. Dr. Morrison examined the scratches with his magnifying glass. "These are fresh," he said quietly, "made within the last few days." He looked at Mrs. Hartwell's hands, then at me. Her fingernails were short, neatly trimmed, and clean. We resealed the casket that day and buried Mrs. Hartwell again. I filled the grave carefully, using extra soil and packing it down hard. The next morning, Plot 47B was perfectly level, but sometimes, especially on quiet afternoons when the wind is still, I walk past that grave and listen, just to make sure the earth is truly at rest. Because I know what I heard down there, in that impossible gap between life and death, the sound of someone trying to come home. The angel cried real tears, and they were always warm. I'm Elena, and I've been caretaker at St. Mary's Cemetery for 15 years. I know every headstone, every tree, every corner of these 37 acres. But there's one monument that's never made sense to me. The weeping angel that stands over Sarah Chen's grave in the children's section. Sarah was only 6 when she died, killed in a car accident 3 years ago. Her parents chose a beautiful white marble angel, wings spread wide, face turned skyward in eternal prayer. The sculptor had carved delicate tears on the angel's cheeks, a touching detail that made the monument especially moving. For the first year after Sarah's burial, her mother visited daily, leaving fresh flowers and small toys. Then the visits became weekly, then monthly, then stopped altogether. That's when the angel began to cry real tears. I first noticed it on a Monday morning in late November. The temperature had dropped to 26 degrees overnight, cold enough to freeze the dew on the grass and skim the water in the memorial fountain. But when I passed Sarah's grave, I saw what looked like fresh moisture on the angel's marble cheeks. I assumed it was condensation, but when I touched the angel's face, the tears were warm against my fingertips. The next morning brought the same thing. 2 perfect tear tracks ran down the angel's cheeks, warm and wet despite the freezing air. I photographed them, thinking I might have discovered some unusual meteorological phenomenon. But by afternoon, the tears had evaporated, leaving no trace on the stone. This continued for weeks. Every morning, regardless of weather, I'd find fresh tears on the angel's face. Rain or shine, hot or cold, the monument wept. I began checking the temperature of the tears with a digital thermometer. They consistently measured 98.6 degrees body temperature. I researched marble's properties, contacted the monument company, even called the sculptor. No one could explain how stone could produce warm moisture. The marble was solid, non-porous, with no internal mechanisms or water sources. Yet every dawn brought new tears. One December morning, I arrived early to find Sarah's mother standing beside the grave. Mrs. Chen looked older, thinner, her face hollow with grief. She was staring at the angel with an expression I couldn't read. "It's crying," she said without looking at me. I heard it was crying. I didn't know what to say. Mrs. Chen reached out and touched the angel's cheek, just as I had done so many times. Her hand came away wet. "Sarah always cried when she was scared," Mrs. Chen whispered. "She was scared of the dark, scared of being alone. I shouldn't have stopped coming." She knelt and placed a small stuffed rabbit against the headstone, a toy I recognized from her earlier visits. Then she sat on the ground beside the grave and began to talk to her daughter, telling her about Christmas plans, about missing her, about being sorry for staying away. The angel's tears continued to flow as Mrs. Chen spoke. But now, watching this mother reconnect with her lost child, the tears seemed less mysterious and more like a bridge, a way for love to cross the impossible distance between the living and the dead. Mrs. Chen resumed her regular visits after that day. She comes twice a week now, always bringing flowers, always staying to talk. And the angel still cries every morning. Warm tears that defy explanation but somehow make perfect sense. I've stopped questioning why the stone weeps. Some things don't need answers, they just need witnesses. Every morning, I check on Sarah's angel. And every morning, those warm tears remind me that love doesn't end when a heart stops beating. Sometimes, it just finds new ways to show itself, one impossible tear at a time. 3:17 in the morning was when she always walked, and the cameras never lied. I'm Davis, and I've worked security at Greenwood Cemetery for 8 years. Night shift, mostly 11 to 7, patrolling 43 acres of headstones and memories. It's quiet work, the kind that lets you think too much. But thinking became a problem when the woman in white started appearing on my security monitors. The first time I saw her was a Tuesday night in March. I was reviewing the digital footage from Camera 7, which covers the main pathway through Section C, when I noticed movement at 3:17 a.m. A figure in a white dress or gown was walking slowly along the central path, moving from west to east. The image was clear enough to see that she had long, dark hair and appeared to be middle-aged, but the infrared quality made her features indistinct. I immediately checked the other cameras to track her movement. Camera 8 should have picked her up as she continued east, but it showed only empty pathway. I rewound camera 7 and watched again. There she was, walking purposefully along the path for exactly 47 seconds before the timestamp showed 3:18 a.m., and she simply wasn't there anymore. The next night, I positioned myself with a clear view of Section C at 3:15. I watched the path carefully, but saw nothing. Yet when I checked the camera footage later, there she was again. Same time, same route, same 47-second duration. The woman in white was walking past while I stood less than 50 yards away, but I couldn't see her with my own eyes. This pattern continued for weeks. Every single night, Camera 7 recorded the woman's walk at precisely 3:17 a.m. I tried different approaches, standing directly on the path where she appeared, shining my flashlight on the area, even setting up additional cameras. Nothing worked. She only existed on that one camera, walking through a world that seemed separate from mine. I started timing my physical patrols to follow her route immediately after her recorded appearance. The first time I did this, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The gravel on the pathway showed indentations, footprint depressions, exactly where the camera had shown her walking. The impressions were small and precise, as if made by a woman's dress shoe, and they were still settling into the gravel when I found them. The footprints led me to a specific grave in Section C, a simple granite headstone for Margaret Whitmore, who died in 1994 at age 42. According to the cemetery records, Margaret had been buried in a white silk dress, and her husband had visited daily for 3 years after her death, before moving away. The footprints always stopped at Margaret's grave. I began researching Margaret's life and death. She'd been a school teacher, died of cancer, left behind 2 young children and a devoted husband. The funeral director's notes mentioned that Margaret had specifically requested to be buried in her wedding dress, a white silk gown she'd kept for 20 years. Her husband had insisted on daily visits, always at the same time, early morning, just before sunrise. 3:17 a.m. would have been just before dawn in March when she first appeared on my cameras. One night, curiosity overcame my caution. I brought a portable monitor to Section C and positioned it where I could watch both the live camera feed and the actual pathway. At 3:17 a.m., the monitor showed the woman in white beginning her walk. I stared hard at the empty path, trying to force my eyes to see what the camera captured. For just a moment, maybe 5 seconds, I thought I glimpsed something. A pale shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but vertical and human-shaped. Then it was gone, and the camera showed only empty pathway again. I still make my rounds every night, and Margaret still walks hers. The cameras capture her faithfully, and the gravel holds her footprints until morning when the maintenance crew rakes the pathways smooth. I've learned not to question why she appears only to camera 7, or why I can't see her directly. Some journeys are meant to be private, even in death. But I always check the timestamp when I review the footage, and I always walk that path after she's passed. Because everyone deserves a witness to their devotion, even if they're walking through a world the living can barely glimpse. The roses appeared overnight, wilted and wrong, on graves that had never known red blooms. I'm Reyes, funeral director at Mercy Hills Chapel, and I've been overseeing services for 12 years. Our cemetery follows strict flower policies, no artificial arrangements, no red roses, and absolutely nothing that could be considered funeral inappropriate. These rules exist to maintain the dignity and peace that grieving families deserve. But someone was breaking these rules in ways that made no sense. The first incident happened after Mrs. Patterson's service in October. We'd buried her on a Thursday afternoon with beautiful white lilies, exactly as her family requested. Mrs. Patterson had been a florist herself, and her children specifically chose lilies because she'd always said roses were too dramatic for a proper goodbye. The arrangement was elegant and appropriate. Friday morning, I found a dozen wilted red roses scattered across Mrs. Patterson's fresh grave. The lilies were undisturbed, but these foreign roses were clearly dying petals, black at the edges, stems brittle, as if they'd been left in the sun for days. I removed them immediately and checked with the family. They were as confused as I was. None of them had brought roses, and they knew their mother would have disapproved. I assumed it was a simple mistake, perhaps flowers meant for another grave that had been misplaced by a well-meaning visitor. But the next week, the same thing happened at Mr. Rodriguez's burial site. His family had chosen yellow chrysanthemums, but Saturday morning brought wilted red roses scattered across his plot. Again, the original flowers were untouched, and again, the family denied bringing roses. This pattern continued through November and December. Every grave that received anything other than red roses would be visited by these mysterious, wilted red blooms within 24 hours. Always wilted, always scattered loosely rather than arranged, always denied by the families. I began staying late to observe the cemetery, but I never saw anyone placing the roses. Security footage was equally unhelpful. Our cameras covered the main pathways, but not every individual grave. I did notice something odd in the recordings, though a recurring figure that appeared in the distant background of several shots. A woman in a dark coat, always at the edge of the frame, never clear enough to identify. She appeared on different nights at different times, but always when roses appeared the next morning. In January, I decided to investigate more systematically. I researched every grave that had received the mysterious roses and found a disturbing connection. All of the deceased had died in accidents or sudden illnesses, heart attacks, car crashes, strokes. None had died of extended illness or old age, and all of their funerals had been closed casket services. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop called me in February. "Someone's been ordering red roses for delivery to your cemetery," she said. "Same person every few days, always paying cash. She leaves specific instructions about which graves to visit, and she always asks for roses that are past their prime. Says she wants flowers that look like they've been crying." Mrs. Henderson described the customer, an elderly woman, well-dressed but frail, who always wore a black coat and spoke in whispers. She never gave her name, but she knew details about each funeral that hadn't been published in the obituaries, details about the deceased's final moments, their last words, their unfinished business. That evening, I waited in the cemetery office with a clear view of the entrance. At 8:30 p.m., I saw her, the woman from the security footage, now clearly visible in the parking lot lights. She was older than I'd expected, maybe 75, carrying a paper bag that undoubtedly held wilted roses. I approached her carefully, not wanting to frighten her. "Excuse me," I called. "Can I help you?" She turned, and I saw eyes filled with a sadness so deep it was almost physical. "They died too soon," she said simply. "They all died too soon. Red roses are for love that was cut short, for words that were never spoken. The other flowers are pretty, but they're for endings. These roses are for beginnings that never came." Before I could respond, she scattered a handful of wilted red roses on the pathway and walked away. I followed her to the parking lot, but she seemed to vanish into the shadows between the streetlights. I never saw her again, but the roses continued to appear for several more weeks before finally stopping. Each time, I left them where she'd placed them, understanding finally that some grief requires its own language, its own rituals. The wilted red roses weren't wrong flowers. They were necessary ones, carrying messages that white lilies and yellow chrysanthemums could never express. The turnstile counted visitors, but no one was there. I'm Chen, night watchman at Oak Hill Cemetery, and I've been working the midnight shift for 6 years. My job is simple: patrol the grounds, check the buildings, make sure everything is secure until morning. The cemetery closes to visitors at sunset, and the electronic turnstile at the main entrance locks automatically. Only staff members have key cards to override the system after hours. The anomaly started in late January, during a particularly cold stretch. I was making my 11 p.m. rounds when I heard the distinctive click of the turnstile rotating. It's a heavy mechanical sound, impossible to mistake or accidentally trigger. Someone had just entered the cemetery. I hurried to the main entrance, expecting to find a confused visitor, or perhaps someone who'd gotten locked in during the day. The turnstile's digital counter showed one additional entry since I'd checked it an hour earlier, but the area was completely empty. No footprints in the snow, no signs of anyone passing through. I called the cemetery office and asked them to check the key card logs. No authorized entries were recorded after 5 p.m. I searched the entire grounds that night, checking every building, every corner, every possible hiding spot. I found nothing. The next night, it happened again. Same time, 11:07 p.m., exactly same single click of the turnstile. The counter advanced by one, but no one was there. This continued for a week, always at 11:07, always registering exactly one entry. I began positioning myself with a direct view of the turnstile at 11 p.m. From my vantage point behind the administration building, I could see the entire entrance area clearly. At 11:07, I watched the turnstile arm rotate one full turn, accompanied by its mechanical click and the soft beep of the counter advancing, but nothing passed through. The turnstile moved by itself, as if pushed by invisible hands. The cemetery's electronic system recorded these phantom entries meticulously. By February, the visitor count was showing 43 more entries than actual people had passed through during daylight hours. I reported this to my supervisor, assuming it was a mechanical malfunction. We had a technician examine the turnstile, but he found nothing wrong. The system was functioning perfectly. Maybe it's the cold weather affecting the mechanisms, he suggested. But the phantom entries continued even during warmer days. Always at the same time. Always just one. I started researching the cemetery's history, looking for anything that might explain the 11:07 timing. In the cemetery's old visitor logs from the 1960s, I found something interesting. A woman named Dorothy Mills had visited every evening at that exact time for 3 years, from 1964 to 1967. Her entry in the records was always the last one each day she'd arrive, just before closing, stay until dark, then leave. Dorothy was visiting her son's grave. Timothy Mills had been killed in Vietnam in 1964 at age 19. According to the records, Dorothy never missed a day for 3 years. Then, abruptly, the visits stopped. A note in the file mentioned that Dorothy had died of a heart attack in March 1967, found collapsed beside Timothy's grave during what would have been her usual evening visit. Timothy's grave was in Section E, about 200 yards from the main entrance. I walked the direct route between the turnstile and his headstone, timing my steps. At a normal walking pace, it took exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds, meaning someone entering at 11:07 would reach Timothy's grave at 11:30. The next night, I positioned myself near Section E at 11:10. At 11:11, I heard something that made my heart skip the soft sound of footsteps on the gravel pathway, moving toward Timothy's grave. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear each step clearly, getting closer and then stopping right beside Timothy's headstone. For the next 20 minutes, I listened to the sounds of someone tending a grave, the rustle of flowers being arranged, the scrape of debris being cleared away, even what sounded like quiet conversation. Then, at 11:32, the footsteps resumed, heading back toward the entrance. I followed the invisible presence, hearing each step on the pathway. At 11:37, The turnstile clicked again, this time in the opposite direction, registering an exit. The counter dropped by 1, returning to its previous number. Now I understand why the turnstile counts Dorothy's visits. Love doesn't recognize closing hours, and grief doesn't respect locked gates. Every night, Dorothy Mills continues her evening ritual, passing through our electronic systems as easily as she once passed through life. The turnstile counts her, because that's what turnstiles do. They count everyone who needs to come home, regardless of which side of existence they're calling from. I don't try to stop her anymore. Some visitors have permanent access to the places they love most. The earth sang lullabies that the dead should never have known. I'm Sophia, and I've been digging graves at Riverside Cemetery for 9 years. It's honest work, though most people don't see it that way. They think about death and dirt and find reasons to look away. But I know better. Every grave I dig is a doorway, a final threshold between one world and the next. Usually, that threshold is silent. Plot 23C hummed. I first noticed it on a Wednesday morning in April, while preparing an adjacent burial site for Mr. Henderson's service. The backhoe was running, diesel engine masking most sounds, but during a brief pause to adjust the bucket angle, I heard something that shouldn't exist, a soft, melodic humming coming from beneath the ground. Plot 23C had been occupied for 6 months. Mrs. Ruth Ashworth, age 84, died of pneumonia the previous October. The burial had been straightforward, attended by her daughter and a few neighbors from her retirement community. Mrs. Ashworth had outlived most of her family and friends, passing quietly after a brief illness. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would explain musical sounds emanating from her grave. I shut off the backhoe and listened carefully. The humming was definitely there, a wordless melody, gentle and rhythmic like a lullaby. It seemed to rise and fall with its own breathing, pausing occasionally before resuming. The sound was coming from directly beneath Mrs. Ashworth's headstone, 6 feet down in the earth where no living voice should reach. The melody was hauntingly familiar, though I couldn't place it immediately. I worked quietly on Mr. Henderson's grave, listening to the underground lullaby and trying to identify the tune. By afternoon, I realized what I was hearing: Brahms' Lullaby, the classic children's song that mothers have hummed to babies for generations. That evening, I mentioned the phenomenon to my supervisor, Tommy. He suggested it might be settling sounds from the casket or perhaps underground water moving through pipes. But I knew the difference between mechanical noise and human melody. This was definitely humming, complete with the subtle variations and emotional phrasing that only a person could create. The next day, Mrs. Ashworth's daughter, Jennifer, came to place flowers on the grave. I was working nearby and decided to ask about her mother's connection to lullabies. "Did your mother sing to you as a child?" I asked carefully. Jennifer looked surprised. "No, actually. Mom was tone deaf, couldn't carry a tune to save her life. She used to joke that her singing sounded like a rusty gate." "Why do you ask?" I didn't know how to explain without sounding crazy, so I deflected. "Just curious about her hobbies, her interests." "Well, she was a nurse for 40 years, Jennifer said. Worked in pediatrics mostly, taking care of sick children. She always regretted not being able to sing them to sleep like the other nurses did. Said it was her one professional failure, that she couldn't offer the comfort of a lullaby." That afternoon, the humming from Plot 23C grew stronger and more complex. It wasn't just Brahms' Lullaby anymore. I could make out fragments of other children's songs. "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," "Rockabye Baby," "Hush, Little Baby." The melodies flowed together seamlessly, as if performed by someone who had practiced them for decades. I began staying late to listen, sitting on a bench near Mrs. Ashworth's grave as evening approached. The humming was most pronounced around sunset, when the cemetery grew quiet and shadows lengthened between the headstones. Sometimes I could hear multiple melodies layered together, creating harmonies that no single voice could produce. One evening, Jennifer returned with fresh flowers. She arrived just as the humming began its evening concert, and I watched her face change as she heard it too. "That's impossible," she whispered, kneeling beside the grave. "That's Mom's voice, but she could never. She couldn't sing like that." The humming continued, beautiful and clear, note-perfect renditions of songs that comfort frightened children and ease worried minds to sleep. Jennifer began crying, pressing her hands against the earth. "She always wanted to sing like this," she said. 40 years of taking care of babies, and she never got to offer them the one thing she thought mattered most. I understood then what was happening in Plot 23C. Mrs. Ashworth had found her voice in death, perfected the gift that had eluded her in life. Somewhere beneath 6 feet of earth and sealed inside a casket, she was finally singing the lullabies she dreamed of offering to countless children who needed comfort in the dark. The humming continues every evening as the sun sets over Riverside Cemetery. I've stopped trying to explain it to others. Some gifts are too precious to question. Mrs. Ashworth spent 4 decades caring for children without being able to sing them to sleep. Now she has eternity to perfect every lullaby she never got to share. I listen to her concerts from my bench, and sometimes I hum along. Everyone deserves an audience for their dreams, especially when those dreams finally find their voice. The chapel lights turned themselves on for visitors who signed their names in yesterday's dust. I'm Kane, licensed mortician at Eternal Rest Funeral Home, and I've been preparing the deceased for their final goodbyes for 14 years. My work requires precision, respect, and attention to detail that most people never consider. Every body tells a story, and every family deserves a peaceful farewell. But the chapel at Eternal Rest has been hosting farewells that ended decades ago. The building is old, constructed in 1928, with high ceilings and stained glass windows that cast colored shadows across the viewing rooms during daylight hours. The main chapel can accommodate up to 200 mourners, though we rarely see crowds that large anymore. Most services are smaller, more intimate affairs. I always lock the chapel after evening viewings, checking every light switch personally. The building uses motion sensors for security, so any lights left on would trigger the alarm system. Yet every morning for the past 3 months, I've arrived to find the chapel's viewing room illuminated, warm light spilling through the stained glass, as if a service had just concluded. The first few times, I assumed I'd forgotten to turn off the switches, but the pattern was too consistent, and I'm too careful with my closing routine to make the same mistake repeatedly. I began documenting my evening checklist, photographing each switched light to prove I'd turned them off. Still, morning brought the same warm glow from the chapel windows. The security system showed no triggered alarms, no motion detection, no unauthorized entries. According to the electronic logs, the lights simply turned themselves on between 2 and 3 a.m. each night. The building was empty, locked, and secure, but something was conducting services in the dark hours before dawn. More disturbing was the guest book. Every morning, I found new signatures written in elegant script, names flowing across the pages in old-fashioned handwriting. The signatures were dated, but the dates were wrong, some from the 1940s, others from the 50s and 60s. The names meant nothing to me initially, just careful cursive writing in black ink that looked fresh despite the impossible dates. I researched the signatures, starting with the oldest entries. Margaret Whitfield, dated October 15th, 1943. Harold Morrison, December 2nd, 1951. Dorothy Chen, March 8th, 1962. One by one, I traced these names through local obituaries and found something that chilled me to the bone. Every signature belonged to someone who had attended a funeral at Eternal Rest decades ago. People who had signed our guest books during actual services when they were alive. Margaret Whitfield had attended her brother's service in 1943. Harold Morrison had come to his wife's viewing in 1951. Dorothy Chen had signed the book at her father's funeral in 1962. All of the mysterious signatures belonged to mourners who had later died themselves and been buried from other funeral homes in town. I began staying late to observe the chapel, positioning myself in the office with a clear view of the viewing room. At 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday night, I watched the lights slowly brighten from darkness, illuminating the empty pews and flower arrangements left over from that day's service. The room filled with warm light, but it remained absolutely silent. 20 minutes later, I heard the soft sound of pages turning. Someone was signing the guest book. I crept to the chapel entrance and peered inside. The viewing room appeared empty, but the guest book's pages were moving, turning slowly, as if someone were reading through the previous entries. Then I watched an invisible hand guide a pen across a fresh page, forming elegant script that spelled Thomas Garrett, February 14, 1959. The signature completed itself with a flourish, and the pen was gently placed back in its holder. The lights remained on for another hour before dimming gradually to darkness. I researched Thomas Garrett the next day. He had attended his mother's funeral at Eternal Rest in February 1959, signing our guest book with the same elegant handwriting I'd witnessed forming in midair. Thomas died of a heart attack in 1978 and was buried across town at St. Mary's Cemetery. The pattern became clear over the following weeks. Every night brought new signatures from people who had once mourned in our chapel. They returned as spirits to sign their names again, participating in some eternal viewing that transcended the boundaries between life and death. I stopped trying to turn off the lights. If the chapel wanted to host midnight services for visitors from decades past, who was I to interfere? The building had witnessed thousands of farewells over nearly a century. Perhaps it had absorbed so much grief and love that it continued functioning as a sanctuary for those who needed to say goodbye one more time. Now I simply checked the guest book each morning and researched the new signatures, learning the stories of people who found their way back to the place where they once mourned others. The chapel serves them faithfully, providing light and warmth for gatherings that exist outside of ordinary time. Everyone deserves a place to return to, especially when that place understands the weight of final goodbyes. She heard every secret whispered to granite ears that had never known sound. I'm Luis, cemetery maintenance worker at Hillcrest Memorial Gardens, and I've been keeping these grounds peaceful for 11 years. My job involves mowing, weeding, repairing headstones, and generally maintaining the dignity that grieving families expect. Most visitors come and go quietly, leaving flowers and taking comfort. But there's one grave that draws confessions from strangers who don't even know why they're talking. The headstone belongs to Anna Reeves, who died in 1987 at age 34. According to the cemetery records, Anna was born profoundly deaf and never spoke. She communicated through sign language and writing, living a full life despite her silence. The inscription on her granite marker reads simply, Anna Reeves, beloved daughter and friend. She heard with her heart. I first noticed people talking to Anna's grave about 6 months ago. Not the usual conversations that mourners have with their loved ones, but something different. Strangers would approach her headstone, kneel down, and begin speaking in hushed, urgent tones. They weren't visiting Anna, they didn't know her. They were telling her secrets. The first person I observed was a middle-aged businessman in an expensive suit. He spent his lunch hour sitting beside Anna's grave, confessing what sounded like financial crimes. I've been embezzling from the pension fund for 3 years, he whispered to the granite. My wife doesn't know. My partners don't know. But I can't carry this alone anymore. A week later, I saw a teenage girl skip school to visit Anna. She sat cross-legged on the grass and poured out a story about bullying classmates, spreading rumors, and feeling terrible about the damage she'd caused. I don't know why I'm telling you this, she said to the headstone. I just feel like you'll understand. This pattern, repeated constantly. People of all ages and backgrounds would find themselves drawn to Anna's grave, compelled to share their deepest secrets with someone who had never been able to hear. They always left looking lighter. as if some burden had been lifted from their shoulders. I became curious about what drew these confessors to Anna specifically. Hillcrest has over 3,000 graves, but people consistently chose hers. I began listening discreetly from behind nearby maintenance equipment, documenting the phenomenon. The secrets ranged from minor guilt to major crimes. A mother confessed to favoring one child over another. A priest admitted losing his faith. A police officer revealed that he'd planted evidence to secure a conviction. A doctor spoke about a patient she'd lost due to her own negligence. Every confession was different, but they all shared the same desperate need to be heard by someone who wouldn't judge. I researched Anna's life, trying to understand why she had become an inadvertent confessor for strangers. Anna had worked as a counselor for deaf children, helping them navigate a hearing world. Her colleagues described her as extraordinarily empathetic, able to understand what people needed even when they couldn't express it themselves. Anna had a gift for making people feel heard, her former supervisor told me. She couldn't hear their words, but she understood their hearts. Children would open up to her in ways they never did with hearing counselors. One afternoon, I witnessed something that changed my understanding of what was happening at Anna's grave. A woman in her 60s approached the headstone, looking distressed and uncertain. She knelt down and began speaking, but instead of confessing a secret, she was asking for forgiveness. "Anna, I'm Mrs. Patterson from the school district," she said. "I was the administrator who fought against hiring you back in 1985. I said deaf people couldn't be effective counselors, that the children needed someone who could hear them properly. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The woman continued, explaining how she'd learned about Anna's success, her impact on the children she'd helped, her reputation as a healer who heard with her heart instead of her ears. "I spent my whole career thinking that listening required hearing," she whispered. "You proved me wrong." I realized then that Anna's headstone had become a confessional, not despite her deafness, but because of it. People instinctively understood that she had spent her life learning to hear the things that mattered most: pain, fear, hope, love, the emotions that exist beneath words. In death, she had become the perfect listener, someone who could receive secrets without judgment, because she had always heard with her heart. The confessions continue daily. I've stopped being surprised by who shows up or what they need to share. A granite headstone has become a sanctuary for people carrying unbearable secrets. And somehow, Anna Reeves continues her life's work of helping others feel heard. I maintain her grave with extra care now, keeping the area clean and peaceful for the strangers who need to speak to someone who understands that the most important conversations happen in silence. Anna never heard a spoken word in life, but in death, she hears everything that matters most. Death had its own choreography, and the deceased were learning the steps. I'm Patel, funeral director at Serenity Funeral Services, and I've been guiding families through their most difficult days for 16 years. My work requires organization, precision, and respect for both the living and the dead. Our preparation room houses up to 8 caskets at a time, arranged in neat rows with adequate space for our staff to work. The deceased rest peacefully while we prepare them for their final services. At least, they used to rest peacefully. The phenomenon began in early March, following a particularly busy week. We had conducted 7 services in 5 days, an unusual surge that strained our facilities. 5 of those services were for victims of a carbon monoxide leak at the Riverside Apartments. People who had died on the same night from the same silent killer. The victims were strangers to each other, different ages, different backgrounds, different apartments. Mrs. Eleanor Kim, 72, lived alone on the first floor. Jake Morrison, 28, was a graduate student on the 3rd floor. The Valdez family, Maria, Carlos, and their 6-year-old daughter Sophia, occupied Unit 2B. Despite living in the same building, They had never interacted beyond polite nods in the hallway. We prepared them for their services on Thursday, arranging the caskets in our usual systematic order. Mrs. Kim in position 1, Jake in position 2, the Valdez family in positions 3 through 5, standard layout, adequate spacing, everything properly organized for the morning viewings. Friday morning, I arrived to find the caskets had moved. Not dramatically, they were still arranged in neat rows, but they had shifted position during the night. The 5 carbon monoxide victims were now grouped together at the center of the room, while the other 2 deceased had been moved to the outer edges. All the caskets were perfectly aligned, with exact spacing between them. I assumed my staff had reorganized them for some practical reason, though no one claimed responsibility when I asked. We moved the caskets back to their proper positions and continued with the morning preparations. Saturday brought the same thing. The 5 victims were grouped together again, this time arranged in a precise circle with their feet pointing toward the center. The arrangement was geometrically perfect, with mathematical precision in the spacing and angles. It would have taken considerable time and effort to move 5 heavy caskets into such an exact formation. None of my staff had moved them. Our security system showed no unauthorized entries, and the preparation room doors had remained locked all night. Yet somehow, the deceased were organizing themselves into patterns that defied explanation. The phenomenon continued throughout the week leading up to the services. Each morning brought a new arrangement, sometimes a straight line, sometimes a pentagon, once even a star formation with Mrs. Kim's casket at the center. The configurations were always precise, always involving only the carbon monoxide victims, and always impossible to explain through conventional means. I began staying late to observe the preparation room. On Tuesday night, I positioned myself in the adjacent office with a clear view through the glass partition. At 2:15 a.m., I witnessed something that challenged everything I believed about death and rest. The caskets began moving slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Mrs. Kim's casket shifted a few inches to the left. Jake's moved toward the center of the room. The movements were smooth and deliberate, as if the caskets were being gently guided by invisible hands. No sounds accompanied the motion, just the silent choreography of heavy wooden boxes finding new positions. Over the course of 20 minutes, the 5 caskets arranged themselves into a perfect circle. Then, for reasons I couldn't comprehend, they began rotating slowly around their common center. Not spinning wildly or dramatically, but turning with the measured pace of a ceremonial dance. The rotation continued for exactly 1 hour before stopping, leaving the caskets in their circular formation, facing inward. I researched the building layout of the Riverside apartments the next day. The 5 victims had lived in apartments that formed an almost perfect circle around the building's central courtyard. Mrs. Kim faced east, Jake faced west, the Valdez family faced south. In death, they were recreating the spatial relationships they had shared in life, but with one crucial difference. Now, they were facing each other, instead of living in parallel isolation. The services proceeded normally that week, but I noticed something touching during the viewings. Family members from different victims began talking to each other, sharing stories about their loved ones. By the end of the week, they had formed connections based on their shared tragedy. Mrs. Kim's nephew exchanged contact information with Jake's sister. The Valdez family's relatives invited the others to join them for a memorial dinner. The carbon monoxide leak had killed 5 strangers who lived yards apart but worlds away from each other. In death, they had found a way to introduce themselves, to create the community that circumstances had prevented them from forming in life. Their nightly arrangements weren't random. They were social gatherings, opportunities to connect across the boundaries that had separated them in the Riverside apartments. I stopped trying to maintain the original casket positions after that. If the deceased wanted to spend their final days getting to know their neighbors, who was I to interfere? Some communities form in the most unexpected places, and some friendships begin after life has already ended. The footprints led nowhere the living were meant to follow. I'm Rivera, maintenance chief at Oakwood Cemetery, and I've been caring for these 120 acres for 18 years. My job involves everything from landscape maintenance to monument repair, from coordinating burials to managing our small staff. I know every section of this cemetery, every path, every tree, but I've learned to avoid Section K, especially after fresh snowfall. Section K is our oldest area, dating back to 1867. The headstones are weathered granite and crumbling marble, many so worn that the inscriptions are barely legible. Most burials there are from the late 1800s, pioneer families and early settlers whose descendants moved away decades ago. The section receives few visitors, which makes it perfect for wildlife and peaceful reflection. It was perfect until the footprints started appearing. I first noticed them after a heavy snow in January. The storm had dumped 8 inches overnight, covering the cemetery in pristine white that showed every track and disturbance. During my morning survey of potential weather damage, I discovered a maze of small footprints crisscrossing Section K. The prints were child-sized, made by bare feet despite the freezing temperature. They led from grave to grave in elaborate patterns, sometimes circling headstones multiple times, sometimes forming straight lines between distant monuments. What made them disturbing wasn't their size or number, it was their age. Section K contains graves dating back over a century and a half. Many of the children buried there died from diseases that modern medicine has eliminated: scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough. The footprints visited every child's grave in the section, including some so old that the headstones had toppled or sunk beneath ground level. I followed the trail of prints, documenting their path with my camera. They began at the section's entrance and wound through the entire area systematically, as if someone had been conducting a census of the deceased children. The prints varied in size, suggesting multiple children, but they all showed the same 5-toed impression of bare feet on frozen ground. What troubled me most was how the prints navigated the section. They led directly to graves that were unmarked or hidden, including several burial sites that weren't in our modern records. Someone, or something, knew the location of every child's grave in Section K, even those that had been forgotten by the living world. I researched the section's history, looking for explanations. Oakwood had begun as a small community cemetery, expanded gradually as the town grew. Section K was the original burial ground, and record-keeping in the 1800s had been informal. Many graves were marked only with wooden crosses or field stones that had long since rotted or been lost. The footprints appeared after every snowfall, always following the same pattern. They would begin at dawn, according to the timestamps on my security cameras, and continue until full daylight. By afternoon, normal foot traffic and maintenance activities would obscure the prints, but they were always clearly visible during morning hours. One February morning, I arrived early to photograph the prints while they were still fresh. The snow had fallen overnight, and Section K was covered in tiny footprints as usual. But this time, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. The prints were still being made. I could see small depressions forming in the snow, following the familiar pattern from grave to grave, but nothing was making them. No visible presence, no disturbance of the air, just the steady appearance of child-sized footprints in the pristine snow. I followed the forming prints at a respectful distance, watching them lead to Sarah Mitchell's grave, age 7, died of scarlet fever in 1873. The invisible presence stopped there, and I could see the snow compressing as if someone small was kneeling beside the headstone. For 10 minutes, the area around Sarah's grave showed signs of activity. Snow was brushed away from the inscription, and small handprints appeared on the stone's surface. Then the presence moved on, leaving behind clear evidence of a child's loving attention to a grave that no living person had visited in decades. I began leaving small offerings in Section K: cookies, toys, flowers suitable for children. They were always gone by morning, never scattered by wind or taken by animals, but carefully collected as if by grateful hands. The footprints continue to appear after every snowfall, maintaining the same vigilant pattern. The children of Section K are caring for each other, creating a community that transcends the boundaries of individual graves and family plots. Death hasn't separated them, it's brought them together in ways that life never could. I've stopped questioning why bare feet don't leave prints in summer soil, or why invisible children can navigate a cemetery better than its living caretaker. Some mysteries are more beautiful than any explanation could be. The children of Section K have found each other across the centuries, and they're making sure no one is forgotten or alone. Now I simply maintain their section with extra care, keeping the pathways clear and the monuments stable for visitors who see with different eyes than mine. Every cemetery needs caretakers, and Section K has the very best children who understand that love doesn't end when life does. The phone rang, with messages from voices I had prepared for silence. I'm Grace, licensed embalmer at Peaceful Valley Mortuary, and I've been preparing the deceased for their final rest for 13 years. My work requires technical precision, artistic skill, and deep respect for both the dead and their families. The preparation room is my domain, a sterile, quiet space where I help people look peaceful for their last goodbyes. It's always been a place of silence, until the phone started ringing with impossible calls. The preparation room has a single landline extension, used primarily for communicating with the front office during working hours. The phone rarely rings after 5 p.m., and never during the overnight hours when I sometimes work alone on complex restorations. But 3 months ago, that silence was broken by calls that shouldn't exist. The first call came on a Tuesday night in March. I was working late on Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had suffered significant trauma in a car accident. The restoration was delicate work, requiring several hours of careful attention. At 11:47 p.m., the phone rang once, a single, sharp bell that echoed through the preparation room. I paused my work and waited, expecting a second ring that never came. One ring usually meant a missed dial or technical glitch. I returned to Mrs. Prasso, Henderson's restoration, but the interruption had broken my concentration. Something about that single ring felt deliberate, purposeful. The next night, the same thing happened. 11:47 p.m., one ring, silence. I began paying attention to the timing, documenting each occurrence. The pattern was consistent every night at the same time. One ring, no more. After a week of single rings, curiosity overcame my professional caution. When the phone rang at 11:47 p.m., I answered. Peaceful Valley Mortuary, I said, following standard protocol. The voice that responded made my blood freeze. Grace, this is Mrs. Henderson. You did beautiful work on my face, dear. My family won't be disappointed. I recognized the voice immediately, elderly, gentle, with the slight tremor I'd heard during Mrs. Henderson's final viewing when her daughter played a recording of her mother singing. But Mrs. Henderson had been dead for 6 days. I had prepared her body myself, watched her casket lowered into the ground, signed the completion documents. The line went dead after her message, leaving me staring at the phone with shaking hands. I checked Mrs. Henderson's file, confirming what I already knew. She was deceased, buried, gone. Yet somehow, she had called to thank me for my work. The calls continued nightly, always at 11:47 p.m., always one ring. Sometimes I answered, sometimes I didn't. When I did answer, I heard voices. I recognized people I had prepared for burial weeks or months earlier. Each caller expressed gratitude for my work, commenting on specific details of their restoration. Mr. Rodriguez thanked me for fixing the damage from his construction accident. You made me look like myself again, Grace. My wife was able to say goodbye properly. Mrs. Chen appreciated how I had restored her appearance after a long illness. I looked healthy again, like I used to. That meant everything to my children. The conversations were brief, always focused on my embalming work. The voices sounded exactly as I remembered them from family recordings or final conversations I had overheard during viewings. But they also sounded distant, as if calling from a great distance or through interference. I began researching the phenomenon, looking for similar experiences in mortuary science literature. I found scattered reports of unusual encounters, but nothing that matched my situation exactly. Most funeral professionals dismissed such stories as stress-related hallucinations or psychological projections. But the calls were too consistent, too detailed, too specific to my work. The deceased were calling to provide feedback on my professional services, commenting on technical aspects that only they would know from the inside. One night in May, I received a call that changed my understanding of what was happening. The voice belonged to Timothy Walsh, a young man I had prepared after a motorcycle accident. But Timothy's message was different from the others. "Grace, this is Tim Walsh. I wanted to warn you about the Patterson case coming in tomorrow. She's going to be more challenging than the paperwork indicates. There's damage to the left temporal region that isn't mentioned in the medical examiner's report. You'll need extra time and the specialized putty compound." The call ended, leaving me bewildered. Timothy had died 3 months ago. How could he know about a case that hadn't arrived yet? The next morning, Mrs. Patterson's body was delivered to the mortuary. The paperwork described standard preparation requirements. But when I examined her, I found exactly what Timothy had described: significant temporal damage that would require specialized repair techniques and extra time. I realized then that the calls weren't just expressions of gratitude. They were professional consultations from colleagues who understood my work in ways the living never could. The deceased were sharing information about incoming cases, warning me about challenges, offering guidance based on their unique perspective. The nightly calls have become part of my routine. At 11:47 p.m., I pause my work and answer the phone, ready to receive feedback, guidance, or warnings from people whose final appearance I had crafted with care. Sometimes they express appreciation, sometimes they offer technical advice, and sometimes they simply want to tell someone who will understand that they're at peace. I've stopped questioning the impossibility of these conversations. The dead have insights about death that the living can't access, and they're sharing that knowledge with someone who bridges their world and ours. Every body tells a story, but now I know that some stories continue long after the final chapter seems to end. My work has improved dramatically since the calls began. I approach each restoration with greater insight, better preparation, and deeper understanding of what the deceased need from their final appearance. The phone rings every night at 11:47 p.m., and I answer it knowing that the best professional advice comes from those who have experienced death firsthand. The grass grew wild above hearts that refused to stop beating. I'm James, head groundskeeper at Memorial Garden Cemetery, and I've been maintaining these grounds for 22 years. My work involves everything from landscape design to soil management, from irrigation systems to pest control. I understand the rhythms of growth and decay, the cycles that govern all living things. But Row 15 defies every natural law I've learned. Memorial Gardens covers 68 acres of rolling hills and mature trees, divided into 37 sections with carefully numbered rows. Most areas require standard maintenance: weekly mowing during growing season, seasonal fertilization, routine irrigation. Row 15, located in the heart of Section M, needs cutting twice weekly and shows growth patterns that make no scientific sense. The anomaly began 2 years ago during an unusually wet spring. I noticed that the grass in Row 15 was growing significantly faster than surrounding areas, requiring extra attention to maintain uniform appearance. Initially, I attributed this to soil composition or drainage issues. Some areas naturally support more vigorous growth than others. But the accelerated growth continued through summer drought, winter frost, and every seasonal change since. Row 15 maintains lush, deep green grass, regardless of weather conditions, irrigation schedules, or fertilization programs. The grass grows so quickly that I cut it every Tuesday and Friday, while the rest of the cemetery receives weekly maintenance. More disturbing than the growth rate is what I feel beneath the soil when I walk row 15. There's a subtle vibration underfoot, barely perceptible but definitely present. It feels like a gentle pulse, rhythmic and organic, as if something large and alive were breathing beneath the ground. Row 15 contains 43 graves, all dating from the 1980s and 90s. The burials represent various ages and causes of death, with no obvious connections between the deceased. I researched each burial, looking for common factors that might explain the unusual conditions. What I discovered was more unsettling than any scientific explanation. All 43 people buried in row 15 had died from heart-related causes: heart attacks, cardiac arrests, arrhythmias, congestive heart failure. Every single burial involved someone whose heart had stopped beating, whose final moments were defined by cardiac failure. The vibration I felt beneath the soil matched the rhythm of a human heartbeat. Slow and steady, approximately 60 beats per minute, the pulse of a resting heart. Row 15 wasn't just growing unusual grass, it was maintaining a collective heartbeat for people whose individual hearts had failed them in life. I began timing my maintenance visits to study the phenomenon more carefully. The underground pulse was strongest during early morning hours, between 5 and 7 a.m., when the cemetery was empty and quiet. I could feel it through my boots, a gentle thrumming that seemed to rise from deep beneath the graves. The grass growth followed a pattern as well. It was most vigorous directly above each headstone, creating slightly raised areas that corresponded to the locations of the deceased. Between graves, the growth was normal, but over each burial site, the grass formed perfect circles of accelerated development. One morning in June, I brought a stethoscope from home and pressed it against the ground in row 15. What I heard through the earth changed my understanding of what was happening below the surface. Instead of one heartbeat, I heard dozens, a symphony of cardiac rhythms beating in loose synchronization, creating a collective pulse that sustained life above ground. Each grave contributed its own heartbeat to the underground chorus. Some beat quickly, like excited or anxious hearts. Others maintained steady, calm rhythms. A few beat slowly, like the hearts of people at deep rest. Together, they created a complex polyrhythm that pumped life into the soil and fed the extraordinary grass growth. I researched the medical histories of the row 15 burials, obtaining information from families and medical records when possible. What I learned made the phenomenon even more poignant. Many of these people had lived with heart conditions for years: irregular rhythms, damaged valves, weakened muscles. Their hearts had struggled in life, working harder than healthy hearts to sustain their bodies. In death, their hearts had found a way to work together, sharing the burden they had carried individually in life. The weak heart of Mrs. Patterson, who died of congestive failure, beat alongside the strong heart of Mr. Rodriguez, who survived 3 heart attacks before succumbing to the 4th. Together, their combined rhythm was stronger than either had achieved alone. The extraordinary grass growth was fed by this collective vitality. Nutrients flowed upward through soil, energized by dozens of beating hearts, creating conditions that supported life in ways that conventional agriculture couldn't explain. Row 15 had become a garden tended by the cardiovascular systems of people who had learned to work together after their individual struggles ended. I modified my maintenance schedule to accommodate row 15's unique needs. Instead of fighting the accelerated growth, I embraced it, using the extra cuttings to mulch other areas of the cemetery. The grass from row 15 proved exceptionally nutritious for soil improvement, carrying some of the vitality that sustained its own remarkable growth. Families began noticing the difference. Relatives visiting graves in row 15 commented on how vibrant and healthy the area looked, how peaceful they felt standing above their loved ones. Some mentioned feeling a gentle warmth underfoot, even on cold days, as if life still radiated from beneath the ground. I never told anyone about the heartbeats or the underground pulse that sustained the unusual growth. Some phenomena are too precious to subject to scientific scrutiny or public skepticism. Row 15 has found its own way to demonstrate that love and cooperation can continue beyond individual existence. Now I tend row 15 with extra care, knowing that I'm maintaining a garden sustained by hearts that learn to beat together in perfect harmony. Every Tuesday and Friday, I cut grass that grows from collective love, nurtured by people who discovered in death what they couldn't achieve in life. The strength that comes from sharing each heartbeat with others who understand the struggle. The chairs moved themselves into circles for conversations that happened between worlds. I'm Walsh, Cemetery Director at Evergreen Memorial Park, and I've been managing this facility for 19 years. My responsibilities include overseeing daily operations, coordinating with families, and ensuring that our grounds provide the peace and dignity that mourning requires. Our chapel hosts memorial services, viewings, and private family gatherings. But recently, the chapel has been hosting its own gatherings after the living have gone home. Evergreen's chapel seats 150 people in comfortable upholstered chairs, arranged in traditional rows facing the altar. After each service, our staff returns the chairs to their standard positions, 15 rows of 10 chairs each, properly spaced and aligned. This arrangement has remained consistent for the 15 years since we renovated the chapel. The disruption began in September after a particularly busy period. We had conducted 12 services in 2 weeks, including several large gatherings that required additional seating arrangements. Our staff worked overtime to reset the chapel between services, ensuring that each family received the dignified setting they deserved. On a Monday morning following this busy stretch, I arrived to find the chapel chairs arranged in perfect circles instead of rows. 7 circles of varying sizes, each containing between 8 and 20 chairs, all facing inward toward the center of each grouping. The arrangement was precise and intentional, with exact spacing between chairs and mathematically perfect circular formations. I assumed our custodial staff had been experimenting with alternative layouts, perhaps preparing for a different type of service, but when I asked, none of them claimed responsibility for the change. We moved the chairs back to their standard rows and continued with the day's scheduled services. Tuesday morning brought the same thing. The chairs had rearranged themselves into circles again. Different numbers this time, different sizes, but the same perfect geometric precision. The formations looked like conversation areas, intimate groupings where people could face each other and talk. I began staying late to observe the chapel, thinking someone was accessing the building after hours to rearrange the furniture. Our security system showed no unauthorized entries, but the chairs continued moving themselves into social configurations every night. The breakthrough came when I installed motion-activated cameras focused specifically on the chapel interior. The footage revealed something that challenged my understanding of furniture, physics, and the nature of Memorial Park itself. The chairs began moving at 2:30 a.m., sliding slowly across the carpet without any visible force acting upon them. The movement was smooth and deliberate, as if invisible hands were carefully positioning each chair for maximum comfort and conversation potential. The process took approximately 45 minutes, with chairs moving in sequence to form their circular arrangements. Once the circles were complete, the chapel remained active for several hours. The cameras showed subtle movements, chairs rocking gently as if occupied, occasional adjustments to positioning, even what appeared to be chairs turning slightly, as if their invisible occupants were following conversations around the circles. At 5:45 a.m., the chairs would begin returning to their standard rows, moving with the same careful precision they had shown during arrangement. By 6 a.m., the chapel looked exactly as we had left it the previous evening. I researched the families who had used the chapel during our recent busy period, looking for connections that might explain the phenomenon. What I discovered was a pattern of interrupted relationships. People who had died before important conversations could happen. Families torn apart by sudden loss. Friends separated by unexpected death. Mrs. Martinez had died of a heart attack while estranged from her sister after a 20-year argument. Mr. Thompson had passed away before reconciling with his son. The Patterson family had lost their teenage daughter in a car accident, cutting short countless conversations about her future, her dreams, her fears. The circular chair arrangements weren't random. They were facilitating the conversations that death had interrupted. The chapel was providing space for people to finish discussions that life had left incomplete, to say things that had been left unsaid, to heal relationships that had been severed by time and mortality. I began leaving notebooks and pens in the chapel, curious whether our invisible visitors might want to leave messages. Each morning, I found pages filled with handwriting I didn't recognize, apologies, expressions of love, explanations of misunderstandings, forgiveness offered and received. One notebook entry particularly moved me. Dear Maria, I'm sorry we fought about such small things. I love you, and I miss our talks. Thank you for meeting me here, where we can remember how to be sisters again. Rosa. The entries were signed with names that matched recent services, people who had attended funerals and viewings in our chapel, both deceased and living family members. The invisible gatherings were bringing together both sides of death's divide, creating space for healing that transcended the boundary between life and death. I stopped trying to maintain the standard row arrangement. If the chapel wanted to host conversation circles for people who needed to reconnect, that seemed like the highest purpose a memorial facility could serve. The chairs continued their nightly rearrangement, and the notebooks filled with messages of reconciliation and love. Families began commenting on how peaceful they felt in our chapel, how much better they slept after services, how their grief seemed more manageable. They didn't know about the midnight conversations or the healing circles, but they sensed the results: relationships restored, forgiveness granted, love affirmed despite the presence of death. Our chapel has become more than a venue for memorial services. It's a meeting place for souls who need to finish what life interrupted. A space where chairs arrange themselves into circles of healing and conversation continues across the boundaries of existence. Every morning, I reset the chairs to their standard rows, knowing they'll rearrange themselves again that night. Some conversations are too important to let death have the final word, and our chapel makes sure those conversations can continue in circles of love that form themselves in the quiet hours before dawn. The files wrote themselves, documenting burials that existed only in parallel worlds. I'm Morton, file clerk and records keeper at Sunset Hills Cemetery, and I've been maintaining our burial documentation for 26 years. My work involves tracking every interment, managing genealogical requests, and ensuring that our records accurately reflect the reality of who rests in our grounds. Precision is essential. Families depend on accurate information, and legal requirements demand meticulous documentation. But recently, our filing system has been documenting burials that never happened. Sunset Hills has operated continuously since 1892, accumulating over 40,000 burial records in our archives. The filing system combines original handwritten ledgers with modern computer databases, creating a comprehensive record of every person interred in our 375 acres. I maintain both systems personally, entering new burials into the computer database, while also completing handwritten entries in our traditional ledgers. The handwritten records provide backup documentation and maintain historical continuity with our oldest files. The anomaly began appearing in November, when I discovered burial entries that I hadn't written. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, same pen pressure, same letter formation, same organizational style, I'd developed over decades of record keeping. But the entries documented burials that had never occurred. The first mysterious entry appeared in Section R, Plot 247. Eleanor Whitman, age 67, died November 15, 2023. Cremation services, ashes scattered. I recognized Eleanor's name from recent obituaries, but she had specifically chosen cremation with scattering at sea. She was never buried at Sunset Hills, never purchased a plot, never had any connection to our cemetery. I assumed I had made an error, perhaps confusing Eleanor with another case. I marked the entry as incorrect and continued my normal filing routine. But the next day brought another impossible entry in my own handwriting. Robert Chen, age 45, died November 18, 2023. Plot 156C. Traditional burial, bronze casket. Robert Chen had also been in the obituaries, but his family had chosen cremation, followed by memorial service at their church. No burial, no casket, no plot purchase. Yet my handwriting documented a traditional interment that never happened. Over the following weeks, these phantom entries multiplied. Every few days, I'd find new burial records written in my own hand, documenting cemetery services for people who had chosen cremation, donated their bodies to science, or been buried in other facilities. The phantom records were detailed and accurate. Correct death dates, proper formatting, realistic plot assignments, but they described alternate versions of actual deaths. I began cross-referencing the phantom entries with local obituaries, trying to understand the pattern. Every mysterious record corresponded to someone who had actually died in our area, but had not been buried at Sunset Hills. My handwriting was creating an alternative history, where these people had chosen our cemetery instead of their actual final arrangements. The phantom entries weren't random, they followed specific patterns. People who had chosen cremation were recorded as receiving traditional burials. Bodies donated to science were documented as having elaborate funeral services. Individuals buried in other cemeteries appeared in our records with different plot locations and service details. Most disturbing was the accuracy of details I couldn't possibly know. The phantom records included information about casket selections, flower arrangements, and family preferences that weren't mentioned in published obituaries. Someone was providing insider knowledge about alternative funeral plans that existed only in imagination. I began staying late to observe the record room, hoping to catch whoever was creating these entries. On a Tuesday evening in December, I positioned myself where I could watch the filing area without being easily detected. At 11:15 p.m., I witnessed something that defied rational explanation. I saw my own hand writing in the ledger, but I wasn't controlling the movement. My fingers held the pen and formed letters with my characteristic style, but I was watching from across the room while my disembodied hand completed a burial entry for Margaret Santos, who had died that morning and chosen cremation. The writing process was methodical and careful, exactly matching my normal documentation routine. When the entry was complete, the pen was placed in its proper holder, and the phantom hand disappeared. I approached the ledger and found a perfect record of Margaret Santos receiving traditional burial services that would never occur. I researched the phenomenon through mortuary science literature and parapsychological studies, finding scattered references to automatic writing and psychographic documentation. Some theories suggested that parallel realities occasionally bleed through into our world, creating records of events that happened in alternate timelines. The phantom entries continued throughout the winter, documenting the alternative deaths of real people versions, where different choices led to different final arrangements. I began viewing these records not as errors, but as glimpses into parallel worlds where other possibilities had been realized. One evening, I found an entry that made the phenomenon personal. Morton Kellerman, age 58, died February 14, 2024. Plot 423A. Memorial service attended by 200+ colleagues and friends. The entry described my own death and burial, written in my own handwriting, documenting a version of my future that existed in some other reality. The date was still 3 months away, but the detail was chilling. The record described a heart attack during routine filing work, funeral arrangements made by my sister, colleagues sharing stories about my dedication to record-keeping accuracy. It felt like reading my own obituary from a parallel world. I've stopped trying to correct the phantom entries. They've become a fascinating documentation of alternative possibilities, a record of the deaths that might have been alongside the deaths that actually occurred. My handwriting continues, creating these parallel records, documenting burial services for people who made different choices in other versions of reality. The files tell multiple stories now: what happened, what might have happened, what did happen somewhere else. I maintain both sets of records with equal care, understanding that truth sometimes requires documenting not just what is, but what could be. Every death contains multiple possibilities, and our filing system has learned to record them all. The chapel windows reflected services that hadn't happened yet, mourners I'd never met, and an empty casket that looked exactly like mine. I'm Thompson, night security guard at Riverside Memorial Chapel, and I've been working the graveyard shift for 7 years. My job is straightforward: patrol the building, monitor the security systems, and ensure that our facilities remain safe and secure during overnight hours. The chapel is peaceful at night, a sanctuary of silence where grief can rest until morning brings new sorrow. But the windows have started showing me reflections that don't belong to our world. Riverside Memorial operates 24 hours a day, though most activity occurs during regular business hours. The night shift is typically quiet. I check locks, monitor temperature controls, and occasionally assist with late arriving bodies or emergency preparations. The building contains 3 chapel rooms, preparation facilities, and administrative offices, all connected by corridors lined with windows that face the internal courtyard. The anomaly began in October during my routine midnight patrol. As I walked past Chapel A, I glanced at the windows and saw something impossible reflected in the glass. Instead of my own image walking through an empty corridor, the window showed a funeral service in progress. Dozens of mourners seated in pews, a minister speaking at the podium, flowers arranged around a closed casket. I turned to look directly into Chapel A, but it was dark and empty as expected. When I looked back at the windows, my own reflection appeared normally. I assumed a strange image had been a trick of lighting or fatigue-induced hallucination. Night shift work can play tricks on perception, especially during long stretches of solitude. But the phenomenon repeated over subsequent nights. Each time I passed certain windows, they showed reflections of funeral services instead of the actual environment. The services varied: different mourners, different ministers, different casket styles, but they all took place in chapels that were currently empty. I began documenting these reflected services, noting which windows showed the anomalies and attempting to identify patterns. Chapel A's windows consistently showed services with elderly mourners and traditional hymns. Chapel B reflected more contemporary services with younger attendees and modern music. Chapel C displayed children's services with small caskets and devastated parents. The reflections were detailed and realistic, showing services that could have been happening in parallel versions of our chapels. I could see individual faces in the reflected crowds, red lips as people spoke, even identify specific flower arrangements and casket models. These weren't vague impressions, they were complete, coherent funeral services visible only in the glass. One night in November, I recognized someone in a reflected service, Mrs. Patterson, whose husband we had buried the previous week, appeared in a Chapel B reflection as a mourner at a different funeral entirely. She was sitting in the front row, wearing the same black dress she had worn to her husband's actual service, but grieving for someone else entirely. This observation led me to study the reflected mourners more carefully. Over time, I began recognizing people who had attended recent services at Riverside Memorial, but they appeared in reflections mourning different deceased individuals in alternative funeral arrangements. The reflections seemed to show parallel versions of grief, the same mourners experiencing different losses, the same chapels hosting different services, the same buildings serving families that existed only in other realities. Most unsettling were the services that hadn't happened yet. In December, I saw reflections of funeral arrangements for people who were still alive. Mr. Rodriguez appeared in a Chapel A reflection, lying in a mahogany casket while his family grieved around him. 2 weeks later, Mr. 4. Rodriguez died unexpectedly of a heart attack, and his actual service matched many details I had seen in the reflected version. The windows were showing possible futures, as well as alternative presents, displaying services that might occur based on the trajectory of current events. I began viewing these reflections as glimpses into probability streams, potential realities that existed alongside our own timeline. In January, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Chapel C's windows reflected a service that looked disturbingly familiar. The chapel was arranged exactly as we typically set it, for smaller, more intimate gatherings. The casket was positioned at the front, surrounded by modest flower arrangements and photographs. But this time, I recognized the photographs. They were images of me, my driver's license photo, a picture from our staff Christmas party, an old snapshot from my military service. The casket nameplate, visible in the reflection, bore my name, Daniel Thompson, age 44. The reflected mourners included people from my life, my sister Sarah, my former Army unit buddies, colleagues from Riverside Memorial. They sat in pews crying for me, attending a funeral service that existed only in the chapel window's impossible reflection. I watched my own funeral service play out in the glass, seeing how people would react to my death, what they would say, how they would remember me. The reflected service was dignified and well attended, suggesting that my life had mattered to more people than I had realized. But the empty casket troubled me most. In the reflection, my casket was clearly unoccupied, not closed for dignity or preservation, but genuinely empty. Whatever version of reality this service represented, my body wasn't present for my own funeral. I've continued working my night shifts, but now I approach the windows with careful attention to what they might reveal. The reflections have become a preview service, showing me possible futures and alternative presents that exist in the spaces between what is and what might be. Every night, I patrol corridors lined with windows that reflect multiple realities, checking locks in a building that serves mourners from different timelines. The chapel windows show me that death isn't singular, it's multiple, variable, full of possibilities that play out across infinite versions of grief and remembrance. I still don't know what the empty casket in my reflected funeral means, but I've learned that the future contains as many possibilities as the past contains memories. Sometimes the most important reflections are the ones that show us what we're not ready to see, preparing us for transitions that exist in potential until they become inevitable. The windows keep showing services that haven't happened yet, mourners I've never met, and realities that exist parallel to our own. I maintain security for all of them, understanding that some buildings serve multiple worlds simultaneously, and some night shifts require guarding the boundaries between what is and what might be.